Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode's that egregious film known as The Greatest Show on Earth. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I'm Thomas, and I'm, Buttons, a clown.
Not the first Jimmy Stewart impression we'll have this episode.
Oh, I'll just lasso that impression right over.
Oh, I am Brian, and just right off the top here, I kind of hate the circus. Like, gonna be honest with you, I've never really been a fan of the circus myself.
I mean, this was going to be one of my questions off the top. We might as well, start on this. Yeah, the circus is an interesting thing, because obviously we're talking about the greatest show on Earth. You all know it out there.
Of course.
You're all familiar.
Everyone's seen this movie.
Right, everyone's favorite Best Picture winner. This movie takes place obviously at a circus, and it's weird how, like, when I was a kid, I remember I really loved the circus aesthetic from movies, mainly Tim Burton movies.
Right,
Like
of
Big
course.
Fish and whatnot. So I kind of enjoyed that aesthetic, but then I went to, like, Ringling Brothers, like, the circus that is featured prominently in this particular movie, and was, like, kind of the recognizable circus for a while. And I remember even when I was a kid, I was like prime age, I was like 6 or so. I just remember it bumming me out. Just saw, particularly like when I didn't see any like horrific animal abuse straight up. I did just see like they were really rushing like the elephants and the lions, all this other stuff, just to like get the routines done so they could have the next act show up. And that just kind of bummed me out. And I'm like, I'd rather go to like a zoo, which is slightly less harmful to animals, by extension of like leaving them the fuck alone for a bit and feeding them.
Or like a fair. I feel like a fair is kind of like circus adjacent, right? It's just kind of got like attractions and stuff. It's not like, it doesn't have like attractions like this or anything, but it's kind of got a similar, you get cotton candy and peanuts and popcorn and stuff like that.
And look at the freak show, as the parlance calls it.
Right.
Which I do have a story about that, how I was scared of the concept of a freak show because my dad would always tell me about the story of him and my uncle going to one of these fairs as kids, and there was a whole act where like a woman transformed into a gorilla, and it scared my uncle so bad that he like literally ran into a pole. So I was so scared of these things that like they would go in, like my sisters and my dad would go into like a freak show thing, and I would be just like standing out there terrified, like, no, there's no way, I can't go in there. There's no way. And then you go to one of these things later, and you see these things are like pasted together, like freaking like stuffed animals, kind of thing. It's like, see the Amazing Fish Boy, and it's like, oh, it's like 2 crustaceans like melded together or whatnot. Yeah, it's definitely like I can see why the circus really went out of favor, particularly like the late 20th century, and then by the 21st century, like Ringling Brothers went bankrupt, and now is back, but doesn't have animals.
Even when you watch movies about the circus, of course, you always kind of think about that side of things, of kind of, the treatment of animals, and just kind of the way that they are kind of like treated as entertainment, and, for our viewing and all that stuff, which is always kind of like rubbed me a bit the wrong way. But then you get a movie like this, which kind of is about like the, performance and the magic and all that stuff, which is in this movie.
And to be fair, a lot of it also focuses around more like the human performers. Like there's a lot of animal stuff, but there's a lot like main characters are the trapeze artists or a clown, as is the case with our boy Jimmy.
The clown.
The clown. Buttons himself. Oh, Buttons. Something said repeatedly.
Yes.
throughout this fucking movie.
Or in distress in like a very serious situation, like Buttons, we need you. Like, it's very
For
funny.
real though, Buttons is the MVP of this movie. We'll get to it.
He is, yeah.
For sure.
many
for,
ways.
For a lot of reasons, right? But yeah. So this is definitely a movie of a bygone era. The Greatest Show on Earth from 1952, notable as I mentioned for being a Best Picture winner, the only Best Picture winner of our lineup for this Oscar season. I want to repeat that.
Is that true?
This is the only Best Picture winner of our lineup for this Oscar season.
We picked a good one.
The Greatest Show on Earth, yeah. And we fit this into the E for Egregious category while, you know, we said this at the start of the season, we'll emphasize it. We didn't know going into this much about this movie beyond its reputation as kind of being one of the more lower voted Best Picture winners. And so we went into this totally blind and we're like, oh, this will be interesting to talk about. And I want to say out there, if there are loyal listeners who like watching the movies prior to the episodes coming out, we're very sorry. We're like so sorry that you suffered through all 2.5 hours of this.
I mean, yeah. I mean, what I'll say about like my knowledge prior to going into this movie is I knew that it was a Cecil B. DeMille film. I knew of what his films were kind of like, big and extravagant and all that stuff. And then, of course, which, you know, we've talked about before, we both knew this by our connection to Steven Spielberg, where I kind of more knew it from in The Fabelmans when he watches the, I'll say it here, frankly, incredible, like, train wreck scene at the end, which really was weighing on me this entire movie. I'll be honest.
Right.
I was just like, when are we gonna get to the train car like wreck? Because that's like, you know, it looks great in The Fabelmans and the way he kind of like, it becomes this like obsession where he like has to recreate it with the little trains and everything, and like, yeah, so that kind of like got me interested in the movie. But you know,
that's about 2 hours and 15 minutes into this movie.
It really is.
I'm sure I would love to hear Steven Spielberg talk about the whole movie, because when I heard him talk about it, it was like in his A&E biography, which is like back in like the late 90s, like a crucial text of Thomas Lore, that A&E biography episode, where he just talked about like, I just remember this train crash and it was so fantastical and amazing. I loved it. I'm like, Steven, what do you think of the other 2 hours and like 20 minutes of this fucking movie?
Right, this is the thing where like The Fabelmans shows this movie as being like literally the greatest show on earth. Like it is this like, you know, movie that's so influential and everything. But I'm like, I can't imagine little Sammy Fabelman in that theater like sitting for 2 hours of like a love triangle and like this like weird like, it's just so long. It's a really long movie. I don't understand how he like sat through the entire thing.
To be fair, not the longest movie we could have picked as sort of like an E for Egregious Best Picture winner, because there's like a couple other ones that are much longer, or even ones that didn't win Best Picture. Like we almost talked about doing not Cecil B. DeMille's Cleopatra, but the 60s Cleopatra.
Yes, the Joseph Mankiewicz one.
Right, which is like, what, 4 hours long or something like that?
Yes, yeah, I think it's like 4 flat.
So we avoided that, but at the same time, we did pick one of the ones that, like, you know, as film fans, we do kind of love the idea of, like, checking off lists. We make plenty of lists on Letterboxd, shit like that. So this has definitely been one like this, or Around the World in 80 Days, which is 30 minutes longer than this, or
Jesus.
Right, or some of these other ones that like have a bad reputation, but you're like, well, is it really like that bad? Is it that terrible? What exactly could we get out of this? Maybe we'll find something, you know, at this point that could be underrated about this movie. And well, I don't know if we quite found that this time.
I mean, yeah, well, because like, yeah, the reputation this movie has is kind of like, it's forgotten, and even when it is spoken about, it's very maligned. But it is still like a Cecil B. DeMille movie, and it's, you know, one of these 50s Technicolor movies, and it has like, you know, it's got big stars like Charlton Heston and James Stewart. But yeah, it's not a very good movie, I don't think.
No, for sure. Also, trivia, by the way, about the Spielberg thing, it's also featured in War of the Worlds. You can see like a clip of it like early on, it's playing on television.
Weird. I don't even think I've noticed that, and I love that movie so much, but I don't know if I've ever noticed that.
No, yeah. And, you know, let's go ahead and get into it. Let's play a bit of the trailer here for The Greatest Show on Earth.
Mr. DeMille?
That's a wonderful sound, Ernie.
Yeah.
Laughter from children. Children of all ages. Everything forgotten. Except the magic world they're in. The circus world. You know, one of the reasons we made the greatest show on earth is because the world needs laughter today. That kind of laughter. But the real circus story is more than laughter. It's an exciting story, a human story. It's a story for all ages, from grandmother to grandchild. It's a motion picture for everyone, with a heart and a sense of humor.
So, The Greatest Show on Earth came out in 1952, January 10th, 1952, which is interesting. I'm sure, then again, this is at a different time where movies would, like, do roadshow stuff. So I'm sure it, like, got to the Academy's attention when it lumbered into town like a circus. An elephant just, like, plopping in front of people, like, well, watch this. And as you mentioned earlier, it's directed by Cecil B. DeMille, who is a fascinating filmmaker, mainly because of just the breadth of his time working, which goes from the literal start of cinema to like the mid-50s. That's like a massive early chunk of cinema that he was around actively working during. Like, I read up a bit about his background. I'm not a scholar, but from what I understand, basically he got his start in the theater, and then eventually, you know, as he was working in theater, he got kind of bored with it and decided to, you know, go out to Hollywood with a guy named Samuel Goldfish, future Samuel Goldwyn. We should have kept it.
Metro Goldfish and Mayer.
Hell yeah. But he basically helped start initially Paramount that way. Like, the company they formed together to make, like, this small movie called The Squaw Man, which apparently DeMille made 2 other versions of that same movie. Like, that's the other thing that guy's known for. He making, like, very prolific silent films, making very, like, big, giant silent films, and then remaking them a couple decades later.
Right, which also happened with, like, the Ten Commandments, and, like,
Right.
I feel like that was a big thing, though, of, like, you know, films that were made in the silent era, now that, like, sound and Technicolor are a thing, like, let's remake them and make them bigger and with sound and all this stuff.
And to be fair, also interesting that he managed to survive that long. Not a lot of directors can say that they, like, transitioned into the silent era that well. In the same way, people talk about that a lot with actors, but even directors also had that kind of problem. And DeMille kind of not only did that transition, but also was like, hey, I'm going to make the biggest fucking movies anyone's ever seen. Like, when you watch a Cecil B. DeMille movie, it tends to be massive, gigantic, like, huge sets, elaborate costumes, big stars, and that's all technically in The Greatest Show on Earth. I've only seen a few DeMille movies. You've also seen, like, what? How many?
I have only seen the Ten Commandments, and it was in preparation for this episode. I took that as the opportunity to watch a 4-hour movie. I watched the, like, roadshow version that had, like, the overture and the intermission and, like, all that stuff, and the exit music and all that.
Yeah, I managed to do a little bit of catch-up in that I watched one other movie, which I found out was his third to last movie. Because basically, like, DeMille's career ends with Samson and Delilah in 49, then The Greatest Show on Earth in 52, and then Ten Commandments in 56. So I've seen the end of that auspicious career. And I think all 3 of those movies have a similar kind of, like we mentioned, like, big elaborate sets and costumes and big stars. Like, in Samson and Delilah, you get people like George Saunders, who I love. You might know him as the voice of Shere Khan from the original Jungle Book.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But he had, like, he's in All About Eve. He was one of the Mr. Freezes on the Batman Adam West TV show.
Oh, he's in Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, which I love that movie. That's a great movie.
Yeah, an amazing character actor. And also a young Angela Lansbury's in it. This is the first Hedy Lamarr film I've seen. I would argue Samson, Delilah, and the Ten Commandments do a better job of presenting that kind of, like, wide scope and utilizing all its different actors that well. Like, I'm sure when you watch the Ten Commandments, you were, like, mind-boggled by, like, oh, fuck, they're in this? Them?
Yes,
Them?
yes.
Yes.
There's a lot of, like, I mean, the one that kind of got me was, I think, Edward G. Robinson is being in there. And look, the thing with the Ten Commandments, I will say, is everyone is wearing basically brown face. I mean, to be kind of blunt about it, like, it is definitely mostly white people with a lot of makeup on their face and skin and
Are
everything.
you saying that Vincent Price isn't Egyptian?
Vincent Price. Gosh, yeah. Seeing Vincent Price in there, seeing like Reggie Robinson, seeing like John Carradine, yeah, it's insane. But I will say, like, I think The Ten Commandments is a kind of staggering movie in a lot of ways for me. Like, watching it for the first time, I think it feels like a 50s movie. It's 4 hours long. It is like very, I don't want to say slow, but you know what I mean? It's kind of that old like 50s kind of rhythm, I think.
It luxuriates in every single sequence.
Yes. However, when you get the most incredible like sets and the most incredible costumes that are so intricately detailed and are so like extravagant, and you get like 5,000 maybe more like extras to just be in this movie, and yeah, everything, like just the spectacle of it all is very like overwhelming and is really like sells all of it. And like that movie especially kind of like really like the Technicolor, especially when you watch any of these old Technicolor films, like they just pop. And that movie like really pops. Like all the color in that movie is just really like vibrant, and like I love all that stuff.
I totally agree with that. I think especially, like, we should mention the one Oscar that movie won a couple years later was visual effects. And those are, like, phenomenal for the time. Like, the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff. Samson and Delilah also has a bit of that in that, spoilers for this literally over 70-year-old movie at this point. At the end of Samson and Delilah, Samson, like, gets his strength back and he, like, destroys a pillar. So this giant, like, idol to a giant god fucking falls on everybody. And it's this incredible mix of, like, some obvious rear screen projection, but also really great model work. I think that's the thing.
Oh, yeah.
They marry those two, even, like, for the time, you can see how, like, oh, it's still is, like, massive and big, and kind of makes you look past the flaws. Something that will be very crucial to this movie, particularly the rear screen projection.
Yes. But even then, like in the Ten Commandments, when there's a lot of that rear screen projection, like one of the scenes I think about is like it's when they're like finishing the city, and like Moses is kind of like doing like the like, you know, he's looking through like the little lens or whatever that thing's called, the
telescope.
Yeah, like the telescope thing to like survey the area or whatever, and like when the Pharaoh shows up and is like, "Are you betraying me?" Like that scene is just like incredible, like use of like that rear screen like projection, and you know these models of like the giant like statues and everything. Like it looks really incredible, like even still today in a lot of cases, even though you can see a lot of like the, you know, the seams of the work, it still looks really extravagant and everything.
Particularly the opening, which, like, I've seen the Ten Commandments many times because it's, like, usually an Easter watch for me. A lot more in my childhood than it was now necessarily. But I just remember particularly, like, the opening bit where they're showing all of the, like, slaves that are, like, dragging behind parts of, like, the fucking statues and shit and the pyramids. It's amazing that they're able to do that in, like, 56.
Yeah, it's a really like massive movie, and I think it's a very impressive movie, even though like I do find it a bit boring. But that might just be my like sort of, I was forced to go to church as a kid, and like I always found it really boring. So I guess that's part of it. But like still, I think it's a really great movie, and like I also think Yul Brynner is like really good in that movie.
Fucking
like Heston is like fine, but Brynner is like really good in that movie. I really like his performance, and Anne Baxter, who plays Nefertiti, I think she's also really fun.
To be fair, at least a lot of like Old Testament stories tend to work better as like kind of isolated from the religious angle of it, even because like even like a Samson and Delilah works a lot because it's just like, oh, a guy is like the strongest man on earth, and then he just gets his hair cut and everything falls apart. Just truly like ruined, because this lady, like the Samson and Delilah is like an incredibly sexist story where it's just like, oh, Delilah really wants to fuck Samson, but he's like, oh, you can choose a bride, and he's like, I'm gonna go with the princess so I can have like power, and I'm not gonna go with Delilah, and she just goes after him, and like stuff like that, or even like the Ten Commandments with like the whole brother fighting against brother thing, and like the literal wrath of God coming down with like frogs and shit. There's an inherent like grand spectacle to the degree they says we don't make Ten Commandments back in like the 20s, then again in the 50s, and we got Prince of Egypt, and
which I also rewatched last night, which fucking rules. That movie is great. I love
Very good
Prince of
movie.
Egypt.
Yes.
I have thought
but
about
then-
rewatching the Ridley Scott one,
Right.
Exodus: Gods and Kings, but
I was literally trying to search for the title, and I couldn't remember.
yeah, a very forgettable movie. But like, I'm very curious to watch that now. Just weird tangent, just because like, does it even like? I bet it has to like at least look good because Ridley Scott's directing it.
I mean, look, even Robin Hood looks good. That movie's fucking
Sure.
terrible, but it looks very good.
Yeah, but yeah, I did want to watch a few more of his movies, but there's stuff like his Cleopatra, which is just not accessible. Really, it looks like I tried finding it on the internet, it's just not there. Or something like The King of Kings, which is like it's a 2.5-hour silent movie about Jesus. So I kind of I was a little trepidatious to start that one because it's a lot.
Yeah, especially Jesus was too into his like slapstick at the time, trying to catch up with like Keaton and Chaplin. I don't think it would have worked out.
He
for
really
him.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that sort of grand spectacle of like you said is like it's in The Greatest Show on Earth. I keep almost calling it The Greatest Showman. By the way,
No, this is not The Greatest Show. That's not what this is.
that movie is also bad. I think.
Look, at least it has fucking life to it. Any circus movie I've seen that I thought sucked before this, I have a little bit more respect for. Even The Greatest Show. That has Hugh Jackman and Zac Efron like dancing and shit.
That's true. It's got Zendaya.
Yeah.
He could have put Zendaya in this movie. I'm gonna be honest.
There were a few problems with that, particularly a certain span of time in which she wasn't alive. Too much of that in her schedule. But, yeah, we got okay. So, Brian and I watched The Greatest Show on Earth, and I still remember, like, I watched it last night, right from the start. I was initially fascinated by the credit, which is my Zoom background currently, of James Stewart as Buttons, a clown. Because I was aware that Jimmy Stewart was in this movie, and from what I understand, it was kind of like a paycheck thing. Like, he got a lot of money off of this, which makes sense for why he would bother to do it. But I did not know he was a clown named Buttons, who didn't take his makeup off, ever, and has a secret past. And as we kind of referenced earlier, that stuff is very fascinating. He's a side character in this movie, but every time he pops up and he's just talking about, like, oh, yeah, I can't, I don't want to take all my makeup off. And, oh, you saw a cop coming around? Was he looking for a doctor?
Yeah, I mean, the only two things I knew that Charlton Heston was in this, and I knew that Jimmy Stewart was in it, but that he was kind of lower on the credits.
He's very much the and credit.
Yeah,
In the modern parlance, yeah.
and like, I'm conflicted with him. I love Jimmy Stewart. First off, I think he's incredible in everything. Anything you watch, right? Whether it's like Vertigo or the Philadelphia Story, or I over the holidays I watched It's a Wonderful Life for like basically the first time all the way through, and I sobbed. I love him. He's great. It's a decision to have an actor who is like one of the most just incredible screen presences have clown makeup for the entire thing. I don't know. It's just so weird. It's very weird that he's in this. And he's not bad, of course. I don't know if Jimmy Stewart was bad in any movies. I'm sure, maybe you could tell me if you think of any.
He's usually good in anything he's in. Like, he's even good when he was dying in his last film voiceover role in American Tail 5 Goes West, where he plays, oh God, I forgot. It's Wyatt Burp, I believe is his name.
Great.
Great. Wonderful. What a swan song for a great actor.
He's good, right? Like, I think the kind of emotional parts he delivers, especially when he's kind of like more emotional and like doing one-on-ones with like Heston or with gosh, what is her name?
Betty Hutton?
Betty Hutton, right? Like I like a lot of the kind of emotional stuff between them because he nails it. He's a great actor, but it's a weird plot line to this movie. It's a weird character, and it is kind of shoehorned into this movie along with like a bunch of other stuff. I think that this movie is trying to do that whole grand spectacle kind of thing, and it's doing a lot of different plot lines. It's got like the love triangle stuff. It's got the stuff with like Angel and like her like kind of boyfriend guy, the guy who like kind of is after her. and like the stuff with like who are those guys supposed to be? Are they like the mob or something? Like I don't know if it's ever like said who they are.
Yeah, at some point they say that they're the guys who used to have the games that would be at the carnival, but Charlton Heston, I think, threw them out because they were corrupt or something.
Right.
So they're gonna get their vengeance in like a couple scenes. Like because this movie is so long and it has so many plot lines, it has that problem of like it'll scatter plot points to the degree that like when those guys came back, I'm like, oh fuck, right, yeah,
right,
those guys. I was even wondering like, who is Jimmy Stewart the villain of this movie? It's like, oh no, it's these guys. Wait,
yeah, well, because there's that early scene. You were speaking of kind of the rear screen projection of this movie. There's that early scene between those two guys when they're like eating peanuts in front of like
front of the monkey.
Yes,
habitat. Yes,
it looks really bad. Like
even so bad.
It. I do like that he's like the guy's like have another peanut and he gives him like the bag and he has like money in it. That's kind of fun, and a lot of it looked like there's a lot of that stuff like when they're at the show, right? And they're just kind of doing like conversations and it'll be like that the rear screen projection, and it looks very spotty, I guess is the word I'll use for that.
It looks like shit, Brian.
I think you're a lot harsher on this movie than I am, to be honest, but
yeah.
But I mean, yeah, but when those guys show up again, I'm like, oh right, we haven't like dealt with these guys. They're still around. Like but the movie, I think because it has so much that it wants to do and it wants to say, and it has like, it never gives them time to really be a villain. And then by the time like what is that guy's name? The one who ends up kind of betraying them, Klaus.
Klaus, that makes sense. He was German.
He was, yeah. When he like betrays, I'm like, oh, okay, that's where this is going. What a weird,
right? Because he saw
detour.
Angel perform at one point at the circus, and she's like, Angel is on the train. No. Stop the train! Don't you see the lights? Maybe we should give people some vague idea of a plot synopsis.
Sure.
Since we haven't really done that. And spoilers, it's going to be hard to do. But basically, the titular greatest show on Earth is a circus that we see. And the main guy who runs it is Brad Braddon, which, such a creative name. Brad Braddon. Wonderful. As played by Charlton Heston. Who is like a no-nonsense. He's very, like, talks in his gravelly voice, and it's like, we're gonna have her be in the center ring, and all this other stuff. And he has, like, a relationship of some sort with Holly, Betty Hutton. There's kind of like a weird will they, won't they going on here.
Right.
There's also Buttons, who we mentioned. Jimmy Stewart, who's, like, the lovable clown who has some kind of dark past that he's hiding. So the circus is still trying to go, but, like, they imply that negotiations are pretty tough with financiers. And it's like, oh, we gotta get, like, a big attraction. So they end up getting the most sought-after possible trapeze artist, the Great Sebastian!
Yes.
Played by Cornell Wilde, which, for the record, that's my favorite thing about the circus, is the weird kind of, like, showmanship names like that, and even, like, the announcer guys.
Yeah.
Like, who in this case is played by, at least, like, the narration is Cecil B. DeMille himself. Whenever they have those really boring transition bits where it's like, look at the circus, and everyone's parading around. Like, he does the same fucking narration bit like 5 times in this movie.
I will say so. Maybe this is where we disagree a bit. I actually like those parts of the movie a lot, and I think that they're kind of the element I find most interesting about this movie, weirdly enough. Because this whole time I'm trying to think, like, well, why would it be so influential to someone like Steven Spielberg, of course, besides the fact that, like, it's got the big train wreck at the end. And I think the way that this movie is trying to kind of sort of showcase in this grand, like, Cecil B. DeMille way, like, this is how the circus operates, and this is how it, like, does all these things, this is how they assemble everything, this is how they take everything down, it's how they, like, move from town to town, all that stuff with, like, the transitions. And that, I think, is kind of, weirdly enough, an element of the movie I found, like, oh, okay, this is what this movie is kind of trying to say. It's kind of about the logistical angle of, like, showmanship and, like, the putting on a show and all that stuff. I like those elements a lot, actually, and I find I get why, like, it would appeal to someone like Steven Spielberg, who, like, is a filmmaker, of course, and could, sees, I think, a lot of the behind the scenes kind of stuff of, like, how this is put together.
Or even, like, audiences at the time, which is, like, a big factor we haven't really talked about. It's just the fact that, like, at this time, you either saw the circus when it came to your town, or in a filmed form like this. There was no other way to see, or if you wanted to see animals, you had to go to like a zoo. Not every town has a zoo. So it's like, oh, this movie is bringing that kind of experience to an audience that doesn't see that often. Which
Right.
I could see the appeal of that, where I agree with you. I think the most interesting stuff is when they're kind of showcasing the actual Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus who participated in this production. And a lot of it is shot in Sarasota, Florida.
Hey.
It's interesting on that level. I think there's a really good, 70-minute documentary about the circus in this
Right.
movie.
Yeah.
Which I think is its big trouble, is that you'll have those moments, and then you'll have the most phony bullshit plot lines that we cut to. They're mostly just really unentertaining.
Because it does all the stuff where it's like, this is how they assemble the tents, and they're putting on a show and all that stuff, which is I think really interesting. And I think seeing them actually set up the tents and everything and get people to do all this stuff, that's cool. And then the next one of those is 45 minutes later, and you have to deal with the plot of the movie in between those, and it's not that interesting, to be honest.
Right, particularly that love triangle that we were kind of referencing earlier. That's between Holly, the Great Sebastian, and Brad. These three incredible people who you really give a shit about. I mean, I'll say weirdly of those three, because I wasn't as familiar with Betty Hutton and Cornell Wilde before this. I hadn't seen them in anything, but obviously Charlton Heston. When you hear Chuck Heston is in a movie, you at least have the expectation of he's going to go for it and enunciate every word. But this is very clearly a paycheck thing for Heston. He's so bored. He literally spends the climax of this movie laying down.
Does, yeah. I mean, I am not, I think, nearly as familiar with Charlton Heston as I think you are. For example, I think the only kind of classic Heston I've seen are Ten Commandments, Planet of the Apes, and I just recently watched Touch of Evil, the Orson Welles movie, which I loved.
Yes.
But weirdly enough, I mainly know late Heston. I know him in True Lies and In the Mouth of Madness.
The narration in Hercules.
Of course.
Go,
You go,
girls.
girls. Yes. It's great. But that's mainly what I know him from. But I agree. I think he's not very interesting in this movie. The thing he has going for him is he is handsome. He looks like Indiana Jones sometimes because he's got the leather jacket and the hat and everything.
Perhaps another inspiration for Mr. Spielberg.
That's true, exactly. But the thing I think he's bringing to this movie is just that presence, right? He has a presence, and he has he's very handsome, he's very striking. That's kind of it. I don't think he brings anything else to this. I don't think there's any real dimension here. I don't think his character is that interesting, really. He just works hard. That's kind of it.
Yeah, and because they tease some interesting things about particularly sort of the supporting characters of the circus, which was really my biggest disappointment, honestly, was that we kind of have this love triangle and Buttons and those fucking dudes who show up occasionally. But a lot of the other sort of side characters are mostly just kind of set decoration. They have actual Ringling Brothers performers, even actual clowns like Emmett Kelly and Lou Jacobs, who I mainly knew Kelly just because that weird hobo clown thing was a thing my grandma really likes. And to the degree that there was a great point, we recently moved them to a nursing home, so we had to get rid of their stuff, and she was texting my grandmother in a big text chain she always puts people in. She's like, does anyone in the family want this little clown? It's so adorable. And everyone's politely saying, no, it's fine, Nana, no, we don't really want it. And then she tried pressing it, and somebody, I don't know who, one of my cousins or uncles or whatever, was just it looks creepy, I don't want it. And she was text defending, he is not ugly. He is so cute. Spoilers, no one bothered with that.
Oh,
necessarily.
damn.
No one got it.
Is it a little statue, or what is it?
It was a little lamp statue thing of him lying on some pillows and just looking
Oh, it's it's a lamp. Okay, that's kind of I wouldn't want that on my nightstand. Personally.
No, looking at you. No, but even though it has some of these original actual talents there, they have a couple scenes where they showcase the weird parade that they do. which
Yeah.
we should talk about some of the details of that later. But yeah, like they show off some of the acts, but then once those plot elements kick in, we are limited to like 5 actors and maybe a couple animals. Like you'll get a gorilla, you'll get a lion, you'll get an elephant.
Lots of elephants.
Yeah, which I feel so bad for every animal in this movie because it looks like they're not
Yeah.
having a fun time. You have that with like a lot of older movies where you see animals where it's like they probably weren't treated very well. But this movie has some of that on screen, like during the train crash, where like
Yeah.
like the lions are having to like get out of their cage that's crashed, and I'm like, this feels like really distressing to these animals and really fucked up.
Yeah. The only one I think is like there's like the one elephant with like because like Angel, I guess like her thing is like the elephants, and like she hangs out with one. She's always like in the trunk, kind of like sitting in it.
The only way to travel, really.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be there in 15 minutes. My elephant's taking a while.
Not giving him 5 stars on Uber.
I mean, look, yeah. Another element of this movie, I think, is the performances, of which there are like a lot, like so many of them, and I get it, right? Because you want to show like actual performers, people doing the show. You want to, I like the idea of showing like cutting to the audience, like lots of like kids just kind of like like, you know, wide mouth, like really excited, and
Some celebrity cameos, most of which I didn't recognize at all.
there were celebrity cameos.
Like there are certain ones, like there's the bit where they glide across like and 2 guys just eating popcorn and like in center frame. Those are the only 2 I recognized, and it's Bob Hope and Bing Crosby.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I would
but-
not know what they look like. I'm so
Right.
sorry.
No, I get it. Look, I only recognize Bob Hope mainly from The Simpsons.
Oh, okay, of course.
Send me down to that boat show. But yeah, so like that's the thing, is that they'll really diverge away. Like you mentioned there's so much going on here, but at the same time it all means nothing. So it's just this like weird, almost like circus style parade of like all these different acts. It reminds me of like sitting through Cirque du Soleil, which is like a really fun thing for like 10 minutes, and the show's 3 hours long.
I mean, yes. Well, because like there is a really great, I think it's towards the beginning. There's a really wonderful shot of Heston. He's in one of those like little trucks, like little cars, and he's driving like through the set, and you get this like really wonderful like shot of like all the
Yes.
performers in the background. They're like practicing and everything. Very Cecil B. DeMille, right? Like just really extravagant, really big, so many extras, all that stuff. That I was like, oh, okay, I'm into this. This is like really cool, just like really extravagant, like circus stuff. I think seeing all the trapeze performances are like really interesting, and I think those are also the best marriage of having the performances and kind of the more dramatic like story elements, right? Because often they're kind of doing it like, I mean, the whole like rivalry thing I think is like, it's kind of fun, even though we can maybe get to kind of some of the more thematic elements a bit later. But yeah, like it's interesting like the first time you see it, and maybe even the second time and the third time, but there's a lot of them. I mean, it's a 2.5-hour movie, and it really feels long. Like it really feels longer than 2.5 hours, and there's just so many of those scenes, and at a certain point you're just like, I get it. The circus is very cool, and like the performances are very like, what these people do is very like, you know, impressive and all that stuff, but it sort of just becomes uninteresting at a certain point, I think.
I agree with you, like that shot you're talking about, the big wide open shot with all the players kind of like rehearsing, is interesting. But then you'll have stuff like the trapeze artist stuff happens, and they always like fake you out, and it's like, oh no, they're gonna fall, oh no, oh, is it gonna happen, oh no. They do that like 3 times in this movie. But then like during those sequences they'll have actual trapeze artists balancing themselves on the wire and like truly like being like 40 something feet in the air, and that's immediately fascinating. But then they'll immediately cut to our actual actors on the worst rear screen projection I've ever seen in a movie prior to like 1960. Like some of the most garbage examples of like Betty Hutton, like, oh, I'm gonna balance on my head on the wire, and you'll see an actual trapeze artist doing that, and then cut to Betty Hutton clearly like right side up but the camera's upside down, being like, oh, whoa. And I really want to emphasize, this rear screen projection looks like sub Doug Walker video. kind of shit.
Oh no, that's
Like,
the worst you could say.
Awful. Truly awful looking rear screen projection, especially like even for the time, like we mentioned earlier, great use of rear screen projection in a lot of other movies. Even like driving sequences happened all the time like that.
Sure.
Like
Yeah,
rear screen
exactly.
projection. There are plenty of like great moments of people like driving in old movies. But this movie, it feels so much more inexcusable because of like how big it is that it looks
Exactly,
this shitty.
Right. Like you said, it's juxtaposing like her on the rear screen projection, and it looks really bad, contrasted with like some really great sets and some really great costumes. It's a weird balance that the movie, pun intended, just it doesn't work. Like it's very weird to contrast those two things, and when you're doing it for 2.5 hours and you're on your like the sixth show where you're just watching these people perform and it's cutting to the audience just like clapping and cheering and everything, it can get very tiring.
Yeah. And like most of the times where I perk up during these circus moments are just weird details. Like during this parade we talked about earlier, there's a Christmas section and also a Disney section.
Oh yes, let's talk about this.
Right, where there's just a point like during the parade where it's like literally they have the announcer guy talking about like, well, here's all our trapeze artists singing this song. There's a point where like they say that Betty Hutton's singing a song, and they have that entire announcement over her going on like the parade float, and they don't show her singing until like they cut away from that and they cut back to her singing. It's like, why did it take this long to show her singing? Anyway, but then there's a bit where they have like the Disney parade, and I was like, wow, this feels weird. Like, how would Disney allow this? And then I realized this is pre-Disneyland.
Oh, okay.
But so like this is the only place where they could actually get like the licensed stuff out there. It's just like, I don't know, put them on the most primitive version of these suits. It's like Mickey, the Three Pigs, Pluto,
and Goofy.
Also the Alice in Wonderland characters, which I realized like is because this came out a year after Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, there's the guy who's like, it's the Mad Hatter, and he's like really, really tickled by like all the Disney characters.
Apparently one of the other celebrity cameos who I didn't recognize. That's the thing.
funny.
Anytime they cut to random people in the audience who have lines, it's probably a celebrity cameo, not one of the Sarasota, Florida natives who got paid 75 cents to be extras.
I didn't know about the Disneyland thing, which makes more sense. I figured that it was because like they don't look entirely like the Disney character. Like the Mickey Mouse head looks a bit cursed in like a weird way. Like it looks very weird, and like it looks like one of those like memes you see of like the twisted like dark Mickey Mouse or whatever.
I mean, to be fair, there are worse costumes from even earlier.
I mean, of course, yeah.
Yeah, they're the nightmare ones. But I think, like, I initially was in that camp, too, because I thought it was going to be like, oh, it's Morky Moose.
Sure, exactly, you're right.
Donald Deek, or whatever, like, skirt around copyright. But they say Mickey, Donald, Goofy, like, all the actual names.
Yeah.
So it's like, I guess Disney let them license it. I don't know. Walt was smoking, like, a couple packs, and just, like, whatever. It's fine.
Well, now Mickey's in the public domain, so it's, they could do whatever.
Steamboat Willie's in the public domain.
Steamboat Willie. My apologies.
That's true.
The Walt Disney Corporation.
Yeah, don't tread on our Steamboat Willie slasher movie, one of 15 that will be coming out this year.
Yes. But ours features buttons, so...
That's true. Buttons in the public domain just because, they were just like, we don't give a shit. Like, I don't know, who distributed this?
I think it's Paramount, right? Is it Paramount?
I assume so, given, like,
it's
Buddy
Paramount.
Buddy. Yeah. Now I'm Paramount Plus. Shocked by that. I mean, because they'll put everything else there on Paramount Plus. Why not at this point? Let's maybe talk a bit more about Betty Hutton, who we've referenced a lot, and also Cornell Wilde, who plays the great Sebastian, because they're kind of like the other two main characters besides Heston in this movie. How do you feel about those two? Those two crazy kids. Did you want to see them get together?
I mean, I will say, I think Betty Hutton is maybe the best performance in this movie. However, I think her character is not given a lot to do and not given a lot of agency or, because, and this is the thing, right? It's a 50s movie, and like, from what I know, Cecil B. DeMille was a pretty conservative filmmaker, and it just feels a bit not great. Her character is mainly just like caught in between these two guys, and one of them is her boss, who like just does not give a shit about her, really, like in terms of like romantically, right? He like she is just like throwing herself at him, and he's like, hey, move that elephant, no, move over there, no, to the left, no, to the left.
I have no time for women. I have to hug my monkey.
Right, exactly. He's got his heart full of like sawdust. Is that what it was? Is
Right,
that
that's the line they keep saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like him, and then there's like the Great Sebastian, who is like the arrogant asshole, and like is like I kind of like the fact that he's using the same lines with like all the women. Like they had hit her, and like one of the other like performers have that line where she's like, he probably told you about like Paris and how like he sees the sun in your eyes or whatever, like, and she's like, how did you know, like, kind of thing. But I don't know, it's not a very great character, and I think only at the end when she like has to like be the boss, I guess, does it give her like that a kind of any moment of agency. And I think it's far too late in the film.
They do kind of introduce that she wants to be like the star of the circus, like she wants to sing
Right,
her
yeah.
ring. She's vying for that. But like you said, they do kind of sidestep any of that. Like the moment she finds out that like, the Great Sebastian like wants to like is like stopping because like he falls at one point. And so Heston like very crudely is just like, well, guess what? I guess you're the center ring now. It's like, oh, but I don't want it like this. Those are the kind of moments where she has this kind of like gee whiz attitude that like kind of works for her character in a really fun way, where she's like kind of trying to be almost like the let's put on a show. Like she's really truly about like the actual show of it on like a performance level, or like the bit where she's confiding to Buttons, and she just says like one of I think my favorite line of the whole movie, where she says, "Oh Buttons, I'm all ache inside." Which is like such like a funny, once again, like gee whiz moment, and like the two characters are actually like kind of conveying something to each other, even though they're also badly rear screen projected in that particular scene.
They
It's
are
really rough. But yeah, I wish she had kind of had like more of that energy, because especially when the movie ends on her doing like the big song, it's like it's the greatest show on earth, and then she closes the show on that, and it's like, I don't know, where was this the whole time? I would just like to see her perform or something like that, as opposed to like actually perform, not have the weird editing rear screen projection stuff that we talked about earlier.
Well, and like I love all this stuff as well, where she's kind of like saying, like, it's at the beginning. Like we said, like they have to hire the Great Sebastian because he like draws the crowd. He's the big act, and so like she has just been given the center ring, but then she has to move out of the way so that he can be in the center ring, because he only does the center ring. That's like his whole thing, and I think her like begging to like Heston, just being like I've wanted the center ring like since I started. Like I've been like down in the in the mud, and like I've done all the work, and like I've just worked so hard for this, and like I like that, and I want more of that type of character, and of that kind of that idea to be kind of like expanded upon more, and give me more of that stuff. But yeah, it does, like you said, sideline her to being like just caught in the middle of these two guys who, one is like a asshole, and the other one is like
also an asshole.
He's an
They're both
asshole, but
assholes.
but in just very different ways. Yeah, but I like her at the end, like giving that sort of performance when Heston is like laying down, just like, ugh, and then she has to kind of give all the orders and everything. Like I like that kind of thing, but yeah, for most of this movie, she's just like going between these two guys, and it's not interesting, and it's just also just not a very good romance in any way. Like not that they don't have chemistry, but I think it's very minimal.
I don't think they have much chemistry together. Like any of these like three people in a room, even like the fighting chemistry that's supposed to be between like Sebastian and Brad, a bit. That kind of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna tough guy you. You're gonna out tough guy me.
Right.
Let's see how we can do with this. And it's so weird because like especially like on paper, what Cornell Wilde is doing is exactly what I would want out of a movie like this. She's just like big and boisterous. His entrance is very fun, actually.
Yes, it is.
He comes over to the circus grounds with like a giant police escort, like a bunch of police cars and motorcycles are following him. And it's like, oh, why is this guy like so famous for being a trapeze artist? And then it turns out the cops were following him because he was speeding.
Well, yeah, one of the cops is like, I caught him speeding, and then the other one's like, I caught him for dangerous driving, and the other one's like, he was doing this. Like it's like all different things that he's been doing like on the road. I think that's really great, and I love him just kind of like it's a great entrance as well of that, because but also him driving and like right through the middle, like he's like the biggest star. He doesn't care about like anyone else, whatever, and like yeah, it's a wonderful introduction to him. And I think what he's doing is very fun in this movie, and I think he's kind of like really playing up that kind of like, I'm the best. I'm the best trapeze artist in the world or whatever. But yeah, he doesn't really have much chemistry with Betty Hutton most of the time. I think there's a few scenes where they kind of like actually, have some nice moments together, but overall it's not really there.
Yeah, especially like after, like I mentioned, the Great Sebastian falls, his arm got crushed, so his right arm is like kind of scrunched up, and he doesn't have a lot of movement or feeling in it.
In a really nuanced and beautiful depiction of what it's like to be like disabled.
Right, to survive an accident and live on with a disability. Where he like initially comes in after like he's like, oh, I'm all healed up, and he's like, well, I'm gonna go. I'm signed up with the rival circus and everything, and I'm gonna leave and goodbye. And then I don't know, either Betty Hutton or Chuck Heston takes off like this drape that he has over his arm, and it's just like literally Cornel Wilde having like a very poorly like scrunched up kind of thing for his arm, like a position to put it in.
It looks like he's like just slept on his arm wrong or something.
Right. Yeah. It's barely anything, and he's like, no, don't look at me, I'm a freak. No, I didn't sign up with the other circus.
Like, I'm Quasimodo. Like,
right, exactly. Don't look at me.
Sanctuary.
After that happens, you would figure like, okay, this is going to create an interesting, different dynamic. There's going to be a bit more of like a fascinating struggle of like what's going on here. Maybe Chuck Heston will change his tune. Betty Hutton might have like some guilt about this. And that's kind of there, but also kind of forgotten. Because like even by like the time like we get our ending for this movie, like we didn't technically have to have him have any kind of like, disability or anything like that. Because he like gives a blood transfusion over to Charlton Heston because he's the only one who has AB R negative blood. Yeah. So like that ending, it just like that whole like subplot like is kind of completely forgotten by that ending, and we're just like, oh, I guess like everything's fine because like the blood transfusion happened, so we're all just good. What was even the conflict we were having earlier?
Yeah, I will say though, I do like during the blood transfusion, and this is again part of like when I really like the Great Sebastian and Cornel Wilde is like when he's being like, you'll have my blood now, and like when you look at your little children, you'll see me. Like he's really like, having like fun, just kind of like messing with him that he's like having to give him his blood and everything. But yeah, I think that's really funny. But yeah, it's a very like weird third act, I think, with like that whole thing, that his accident, and then like the detective showing up, and the kind of weird twist of like I already forgot his name, Klaus being like this like turncoat who like tries to rob them. And yeah, it's very messy and it's very weird in a lot of ways.
Yeah, especially like they have even Sebastian hang around, by the way, during the circus, because
right.
Like he says like, oh, I'm gonna leave, and it's like, no, you gotta stay, and his job now is like handing out balloons to kids in the audience.
Yeah, but he even says before, when like I think Heston is like, oh, we can keep you. You can do a job for us. Like we can keep you employed. And he's like, no, I'd rather like, I can't do this job and like, see all the people doing their trapeze performances and kind of do that thing. But then he does stick around,
right,
to see her or something. I don't know.
I don't get it. That's the thing. This movie like wanders around its plots. It doesn't like really explore them. It doesn't let them run their natural course. It just kind of like wanders in between them in a very casual way.
Yeah, and I think because it's doing so much, because it's having to do the whole like intercut of like DeMille doing the whole like, and when the trapeze artists move to town, this is how they do it, like that, all that thing, the performances, and then like it doesn't leave a lot of room to really flesh out the plot enough. Even though this movie is 2.5 hours, it's insane.
Yeah, I think that's what's fascinating. Is honestly like if we had to have like that circus footage tied together with some kind of plot, I would rather it would just be Buttons' plot. Like we kind of mentioned this earlier, but basically like Buttons' plot is that he's like this doctor who accidentally killed his wife, and then he left, to join the circus, literally, like, disguise himself in paint. That's why he never reveals his paint or anything like that. We find all this out, like, near the end of the movie. So most of the time, we're just seeing Jimmy Stewart kind of look around suspiciously, or there's a bit where his mom shows up, which is maybe my favorite scene of the whole movie. Yeah, where he sees his mom in the audience, and he stops, like, going around with, like, all the other clowns, and comes over and is, like, under the guise of doing clown tricks for a couple kids in the audience, which Jimmy Stewart kind of does well. Like, I don't usually like clowns, but he kind of commits to the bit in a way where I'm like, I would see Jimmy Stewart the clown.
Absolutely.
He seems like kind of fun. He works pretty well with even the other clowns. We see, like, the actual Emmett Kelly and Lou Jacobs. It's like, I don't know, you fit in.
Yeah.
He goes over, talks to his mom, and it's just like, they'll never see me. And like, and she's like, the cops are after you. They'll never see me with my clown makeup on. Or whatever.
Yeah, but, like, even that plot point, there's just not enough in there. Like, I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, how did he kill his wife? What happened? How, like, give me some more juice there. Like, I don't know. There's just not enough of, like, that plot point. That by the time, like, the cop shows up, I will say I did cheer when they show the picture. He's like, have you seen this man around here? And it's just regular Jimmy Stewart. I was like, yeah, there he is.
Yeah, there he is.
Right, and I like the way that it ends. Like, his plot point of, like, they went. We kind of teased it. Like, I think before we were starting, of like, is it Holly who goes after him and is like, Buttons, we need you. Like, you're our only hope. Yes. Yeah, I like him, like, having to do the surgery, and he's like, it's a very great moment of, like, but if I do the surgery to save his life, like, they'll know who I am and everything, but he risks it because they're a family, and it's, and I love his kind of final thing where, like, the cop is, like, arresting him very begrudgingly, like, they kind of have, like, this mutual respect for each other after, like, what he's seen him do, like, saving Brad's life, and him giving the dog to, like, the little girl, I think is great. It's great Jimmy Stewart stuff.
Don't feed him too much popcorn or they'll pop.
Yes, exactly. It's really great stuff. But having that at the end there, and I think the last kind of 20-25 minutes of this movie are really great, and kind of almost tricked me into thinking that this wasn't a bad movie. Because, like, I don't know, when we get to, like, when we're starting to get to the train wreck, and I'm kind of, like, perking up, like, oh, okay, this is it. We're finally getting to it. Because for the last,
you did the Leo point of the screen and everything.
I did actually do that. But, like, because the last 45 minutes or whatever are just, like, you're really trudging through this movie. It's very boring. Just on, like, I genuinely checked the time, like, 4 times while watching this movie, and I was like, oh, I'm only an hour in. Like, Jesus Christ. Like, the 10 Commandments felt shorter.
I had that, by the way, but it was about 40 minutes in, and I was like, well, I'm an hour into this, right?
Yes. Yeah, I had it 40 minutes in, and then an hour in, I was like, oh, I'm like, we got like an hour left, maybe 30 minutes, maybe, and no, there's so much left.
There's a whole nother, like, regular movie after this.
Right, yeah. But what I will say, kind of, as we're kind of talking about the train sequence, I like when they're showing, like, what are clearly, like, model trains, and, like, a model of, like, trees and, like, a river or whatever. I just really like that stuff. I love miniatures.
Well, and also intercut with, like, some of the better, like, circus kind of, like, atmosphere stuff where, like, I love the fact that everything's packed, but before the train starts, apparently, like, all the circus workers are just, like, having dinner.
Yes.
Like, on the side, like, before the train starts. And then the train blows its whistle, and then everyone's like, oh, fuck, we gotta get on the train. And everyone, like, packs in immediately. Like, that's some of the fun stuff. That's the fun decor stuff I wish we had more of, instead of, like, what we were talking about earlier, and also any scene where, like, Betty Hutton is talking, like, with Angel and Phyllis, some of these other people. It's all just, like, them slut-shaming each other. It's just like, oh, you've been around. You've been around. Like, a lot of that.
There's, like, a kind of weird, like, towards the end, this weird, like, I hate using this term, but it's what's maybe like the cat fight kind of thing where, like, I forget if it's Angel or Phyllis. One of them is like, well, since you've messed up with Brad, I'll take him because he'll finally want me or whatever. And it's this just weird, like, just like pitting these, like, female characters against each other, but only under the, like, they all just want this man. It's very, like,
right, you couldn't at least have, like, an All About Eve kind of scenario in the circus, which would be, like, fun and trashy. Of just like, oh, you're all vying for the spotlight, but it's like the circus. So this is all like like very low stakes, but instead it's like you mentioned, like it feels the most kind of like crass in a way of like, oh, this will be in the trailer where it's just like gorgeous gals vying for Chuck Heston.
Right.
Yeah, as opposed to the stuff right by the train, which let's go into the train sequence a bit in this, because like you mentioned, this was featured very prominently in The Fabelmans and War of the Worlds, very much inspired Spielberg. And I think it is fascinating just on like a pure spectacle level. And I get what like why we kind of both had that same thing of like when we saw it in The Fabelmans. We're like, I get it, Sammy. This is like such a great moment. Yeah. Like it truly does feel like the use of miniatures, like you mentioned, even like that's the better rear screen projection stuff where you do see some like people that are on the side, like by the train station. DeMille put all of his real grandeur into that sequence in a way that like I get why it stands out.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it is like it's really a point in the movie where like just some life is pumped into it, and it's like genuinely thrilling, right? Because one, it's a heist. Like basically, it's a heist scene. It's really cool. Them robbing the train and everything, and obviously this is in The Fabelmans, but like the way the car like flips. And like it just looks really great. Like it looks really, really incredible still. It's kind of that thing like obviously like it's using technology from the 50s. You can tell that it's technology from the 50s with like the miniatures and the rear screen projection and all that, but it looks really great and it's really thrilling.
And it's very detailed. I love especially how like the train really looks. And that's where the like cutting to like between the miniature footage and then stuff where we see like actual size people works, because you'll cut inside of the cars and people are like tumbling over and like a big rod goes through the middle of one of the cars at one point. Yeah,
it looks really incredible, and it's just it's a moment that made me go like, where the fuck has this been the whole movie? Like, why has the whole movie not been this exciting?
We finally got to the fireworks factory, everybody.
Right. It isn't just kind of like one crash and then we see the like aftermath. I love how much you see like the individual cars kind of like crumble and like fall and everything. Like I think that stuff is really great. And great just production design as well, of just showing like all of these sets just like crumbling and like falling apart and everything. It's really great stuff.
It's the same appeal that I would get out of like say a Godzilla movie, where it's like in a Godzilla movie, like I know these miniatures aren't like extremely accurate and it doesn't look like a building's actually exploding or whatever when Godzilla steps on it, but at the same time you can see so much of like the craft and energy that goes into like a sequence like that, which is once again very much contrasted by Chuck Heston after all this, laying down just like, oh, you gotta move up this thing, it's crushing me. I don't know, it's fine. And then the elephant helps out, which I don't know, elephant should have just like let that guy fucking crumble. Like you know that he should have like stepped on him, kind of like in that bad scene earlier where one of the ladies got threatened and like a bad elephant like foot is on top of her head.
That is like really like we're talking about kind of the representation of women in this movie. That is like one of the worst parts, I think, especially because he's like it is like that guy being like, you love me, it's all right, I love you and we will get married and whatever, and then he like turns into like the Joker, just being like, I'm gonna kill her. It's
literally has the, like her at elephant foot point, as it were.
Yes. Another thing I think I like about this the train section though is I love when they're robbing it. I love like the shot of him pointing the gun into the like the window, and then like there's that really great shot of the guy with the like, I don't know, he's got like a baton or something. It's like a rod, and just him like waiting around the corner. It's a really wonderful shot. Again, I could see why it influenced like Spielberg, because he does like he loves that kind of shit, and it comes too late in the movie though. It's just way too late after you've watched so much boring stuff in this movie.
Yeah. Though another thing, like more Spielberg specifically, like when we have the actual cast like running around the wreckage of the train, feels very inspirational to, as we mentioned earlier, A War of the Worlds.
Oh yeah,
the plane crash, for sure. Which trivia, you can still see that plane crash set over at Universal Studios Hollywood.
Oh really?
It's on the tram tour. That's still standing. It's been standing now for like 20 years.
Oh, that's so cool. God, what a movie. That's a great movie.
Let's keep talking about this other great movie that we've been talking about. The greatest show on earth, one might say.
I thought you were going to say, let's keep talking about War of the Worlds, actually.
No. I wish.
No, but I like you were saying kind of earlier about like when all the kind of aftermath of the wreck, I do really like when it's like all the people kind of crawling out, and like you see all these destroyed like rooms, and like the compartments and everything like just are like twisted and turned and everything, and like I think that stuff is really great. That I think paired along with, I keep thinking of that opening shot with Heston like driving through the circus tent. I think those elements are what DeMille is like doing best and kind of showing the grandiosity of it. And yeah, the rest of the movie just isn't really that.
No, yeah, and it's interesting. While we're mentioning about DeMille, we should probably talk about a bit more like the Oscar stuff specifically. As we mentioned, this won Best Picture. Also, this is the only movie we're covering this particular season that won 2 Oscars, because it won for Best Story.
So funny to look at old Oscar categories.
Right, as we talked about like in our Rashomon episode, very funny for that. But also giving this movie Best Story. Like, not only is it Best Picture, but the story. It just flowed so wonderfully. A lot of people at the time were even dismissive of it, like necessarily winning Best Picture, because keep in mind it's nominated against High Noon, Ivanhoe, Moulin Rouge, and The Quiet Man. And it ends up winning. A lot of people, especially like in retrospective sort of articles, have said that it's probably because people thought Cecil B. DeMille was like, at this point, he was like in his 70s. He was on the way out. So this feels truly kind of like let's give him an Oscar before he dies. Which is very funny considering he makes arguably his most iconic movie after this. That I wouldn't have minded winning a Best Picture Oscar, quite frankly. I get it with that.
Yeah, and The Ten Commandments doesn't win Best Picture that year, which is very interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen any of the other ones nominated, though. Have you, actually? I'm curious.
Put a pin in that for Between the Lines.
Ooh, nice.
Though I will say I have seen High Noon.
Okay.
And even that, like, that's not my favorite Western, but it feels kind of like, I get why this was very influential at the time, and I could have seen it. That was the more critically hailed movie at that particular time. Because it felt kind of like one of the first examples of like a subversive neo-Western kind of thing. Sure, we're at the end of the Western period. Yeah, as opposed to like A Greatest Show on Earth, it just feels truly like it's a gimme. For like, I don't know, this guy is on his way out. He's a legend of Hollywood. He hasn't won an Oscar before. Let's give it to him for Best Picture. Not Best Director. We'll give it to him for Best Picture, specifically. Yeah, this is definitely... I can see why it's kind of dismissed as one of the worst. Would you say this is one of the worst Best Picture winners you've seen?
Oh, man. Maybe. I was actually looking at the Best Picture winners on a list on Letterboxd a few days ago. I don't think this is one of the worst ones. I will say. I don't think it's a good movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's not very good. It kind of, I think, falls into that category for me as, like, boring Oscar winners, right? Like, it's kind of like, oh, that won Best Picture? Okay. Like, that's, the Oscars, am I right?
It's not, like, offensively bad in a way.
It's some Crash.
Right. Or because, like, I'm literally looking at my Best Picture winners, like, ranked list that I have on Letterboxd. And my bottom 5 are from 5 up to 1, like, worst. I have A Beautiful Mind, which I do think is quite terrible. And definitely
I've never seen it, actually.
A bullshitty, schmaltzy movie. I fucking hate it. It's really bad. Then The Greatest Show on Earth. Then the double whammy of similar Best Picture winners of Green Book and Driving Miss Daisy, which are pretty much the same movie. And then Crash is my bottom one, which I haven't seen since I was like younger. And I remember at the time, like when it was like a Best Picture winner, I watched it. And it did hook me, but then every time I think back about that movie, I'm just like, this all is so manipulative and shitty. Also directed by a shitty dude.
Yeah.
Just truly like a black mark, more so than some others of a Best Picture winner. But Greatest Show on Earth is still, I think, amongst that bottom, not because of like the offensiveness, but just like truly the waste of time and resources that it is.
Real quick, I want to circle back a little bit to the Oscars of this year.
Yes.
Because you were mentioning how this won Best Story. I just want to mention that these were the other two categories of like screenplay. There is Best Story,
right,
Best Screenplay, and then a category Best Story and Screenplay. What? Weird.
You could just give that to the same.
older categories for the Oscars are so weird. And I will also say, just on my second point, my bottom, although it is Crash probably, but also Forrest Gump. I really hate that movie, and I can't believe it won Best Picture.
That one's amongst my bottom 10, even though I have a long, weird history with Forrest Gump that has been documented elsewhere. But yeah, so we've been rambling a lot about The Greatest Show on Earth, far more than I expected us to. Do you have any final thoughts on The Greatest Show on Earth?
I don't hate this movie. I don't think it's terrible or anything. I just find it really boring. I watched it today, and I was already forgetting just things about it because it is not very memorable, even though it has some really incredible sequences in it. I think as a whole, it's just really long. Like, I was kind of joking that the Ten Commandments felt shorter, but, like, it kind of did in a lot of ways because, like, at least with the Ten Commandments, like, you have an intermission and you have different points where you can kind of pause and everything, and you can kind of, like, this just really drags on, and it just keeps going, and it just keeps going. It did give us Jimmy Stewart as Buttons, and I can't hate it because of that.
As Buttons, a clown.
A clown. That's the part I really love, is a clown. It has a really great sequence in that train car sequence. I think that there are really cool moments here. Like we mentioned, that opening like shot of Heston like driving through the circus tent. I like a lot of the ideas that this movie is kind of presenting of like showmanship, the idea, like what it takes to put on a show, the behind the scenes, the inner workings, the like, you know, all of that stuff. I like it. And maybe that's also another reason why it won Best Picture, maybe. Like, I think the Oscars really love, you know, movies about showmanship and, like, you know, a show and all that stuff. Yeah, it's just boring. And it's kind of almost just as bad as if it were, like, an awful movie, right? Because it's just very forgettable. Even though it has great stars and everything, and great sets and great costumes, like I said, it's also got a lot of like the rear screen projection. We talked about that. Like, it's really bad in this movie. I don't know. I'm glad I watched it though. It is always fun to go back to these older Best Picture winners and kind of look into, you know, what was going on, why did this win, what else was nominated, stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna make a strong declaration. I think this is the worst egregious pick we've had on the show.
Oh.
I would say. Van Helsing is far more fun to watch. Wish Upon is way more fun to watch. And Tomorrowland, while a movie I think is very messy, at least has a lot more ambition to it. Especially, like, this movie feels kind of like the movie that, like, when some people complain about, like, oh, I can't watch old movies, they're boring to me. This is what they're talking about.
Perfect example.
That as opposed to, I just wanted to put out there some other Best Picture winners of this decade. This is in, like, before this, you got All About Eve, which is an amazing, great drama, like, full of, like, great kind of, like, people being catty with each other, like, fucking Bette Davis, all this other shit. An American in Paris, one of the great Gene Kelly musicals. On the Waterfront, thorny movie for a lot of reasons, but, like, you can't deny that Brando performance. Even one that I really like that is completely opposite of this movie, Marty, the 1955 Best Picture winner, starring Ernest Borgnine as a guy who, like, lives at home and just ends up sparking up a romance with a lady. That won Best Picture just a couple years after the fucking Greatest Show on Earth tried to be this, like, big, giant spectacle movie. And I think that's the trouble, is that you can have, like, a big spectacle movie that wins Best Picture. I'm like, I at least get it, like, a couple years after this is Ben-Hur, speaking of, like, Charlton Heston. Mm-hmm. And that's a movie that, like, I don't love, but at the same time, like, can't deny the maximalistness of it. But at the same time, I feel like this kind of movie, The Greatest Show on Earth, feels like a precursor to, within a decade after this, you do have stuff like the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra, or Hello, Dolly. Like, these big, grand, like, productions that end up, like, kind of destroying the studio system. This feels like the early precursor to that, even though it did fine when it came out. It cost $4 million, made $36 million, which obviously that's back in the day money. But at the same time, this feels kind of like the beginning of the end of, like, this kind of, like, big spectacle movie that we would get in, like, the 50s era. And I think this is the little domino that leads to the big domino of the new age of Hollywood. I would say, this particular movie. It feels like that, at least, because it's so bloated. It has so many great actors doing, like, very little. Some of, like I said, the worst rear screen projection stuff. I've seen, like I said, green screen that looks better. Or I've seen other 50s rear screen projections that look better. And it's just like, it's this long, boring waste of resources. That's my real trouble with it, is it just feels like people are burning money in front of me. I don't find that to be very entertaining, necessarily. Yeah. So really dislike this one. Would you say, like, what would you say is worse of, like, those egregious picks? It has to be the worst one that we've done, right?
I mean, the thing about Wish Upon is, it is an objectively bad movie. Like, yes. I'm sorry, but it is. And I did have fun. I think I had more fun, though, when we were talking about the movie than I did watching it. It's tough. It's tough. It's a weird comparison as well. And like Van Helsing, I think Van Helsing is better, actually, because at least Van Helsing does have like Hugh Jackman and, you know,
Richard Roxburgh. Remember our favorite Dracula?
Roxburgh, of course. My children. Yeah. It's between this or Wish Upon, which, God, what a cursed double feature.
I mean, look, one is much shorter and much more entertaining to watch, I would argue, on every level.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
This is the only podcast where you can get Wish Upon v. Greatest Show on Earth discourse.
Oh,
that's what we provide out there to the podcast. That's what makes us different. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and get into our regular segment, Between the Lines. So Between the Lines is a segment that Brian and I do every episode, in which we, recommend another movie that either maybe is related to the movie that we're talking about today, or maybe is like an alternate pick for whatever letter we're doing, like E for Egregious. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with my pick, which I kind of teased earlier when you asked me about have I seen any other Best Picture nominees from the 25th Academy Awards, much like Greatest Show on Earth was. And I ended up watching The Quiet Man from director John Ford, starring John Wayne. And basically the plot of this is it takes place in like the 1920s, and John Wayne plays Sean Thornton, who is this guy who's lived in the U.S. his whole life, but he was born in Ireland originally. So he returns and decides to buy the very house that he was born in. But as it turns out, someone else lives there. It's this woman who's played by Maureen O'Hara, who had bought this house through money that her brother had, who is Squire, played by Victor McLaglen. And basically, it ends up being romantic dramedy of sorts, where like he and Maureen O'Hara end up kind of like getting close to each other, and they end up actually getting married. But at a certain point at the wedding, the brother who has all the money is like, I'm not going to give you the dowry. It's all mine. I'm not going to give you any of this money. And John Wayne is very much like, oh, I don't know. I think that's fine. We don't really need money as long as we have each other. And Maureen O'Hara is like, no, but I wanted that money so I could finally be like from under my brother's thumb. And so it's a lot of that kind of conflict that's going on there. I think O'Hara and Wayne have phenomenal chemistry in this movie. And I think even just the atmosphere of it, like this one along with Best Director for John Ford, and won Best Cinematography Color, which we should know this is at the time when they divided that between color and black and white, which I get more than like Best Story.
That makes more sense because it's a different process. Yeah.
Right, yes. The cinematography in this is gorgeous. Like they shoot a lot in Ireland. There is some rear screen projection, but it looks decent. Like I'm not fucking bugging myself out like Greatest Show on Earth. And it's like very lush, and even like obviously a lot of people know this movie as like at least how I'd heard of it prior, was a lot of Irish stereotypes, and the whole town is definitely full of guys who could just be leprechauns. But at the same time, I think like they are like those actors are very charming. Like Ward Bond, who's one of my favorite old actors from around this time, plays like the father who keeps trying to catch fish. He's very funny. Or Victor McLagan, even as like our villain. He kind of has like a weird like Bluto from the Popeye cartoons kind of energy, where it's just like the big brute dude. There's some other troublesome stuff besides like the Irish stereotypes. Like the relationship between John Wayne and Maureen O'Hare is interesting. I mean, it's taking place in the 20s, but there's a lot of like sort of sexism that's obviously like of that time that they're depicting, but also of like even the time it was made and something that feels a bit awkward. But O'Hara has like such a real strength to her, I think, as a performer. Like her and Wayne have, like I said, phenomenal chemistry. But even she, unlike what we were talking about earlier with the Betty Hutton character, she wants to be like independent. She still likes being like John Wayne's wife. She's in love with him. But at the same time, she's like, I just don't want to be under my fucking brother anymore. I want to like have my own experiences, not be like constantly tied to like having to have his money and whatnot. So that's why I want that dowry so much. And you really like get invested in that, even when some of those details, whether their relationship are irksome and might like put people off, and I get it. But at the same time, there's still like this like weird fairy tale charm to the whole movie. It has like the sweeping romance, some of these great shots. Also, I think the other big thing people know about this movie, the last like 20 minutes of this are just John Wayne and Victor McLaglen having a massive brawl that goes throughout the town. Like they fight the shit out of each other. And I love there's a bit where they like stop to have a beer and one of them like spits out a tooth and it's like, you fight real good, buddy. Stuff like that. Like it is also a very funny, charming movie, like I said. So I would definitely recommend you not watch The Greatest Show on Earth and instead watch The Quiet Man, a dated movie. But I still think a lush, beautiful movie that also, I think, has one of the better John Wayne performances I've seen. I haven't seen a lot of, like, the big Wayne ones, but this one he actually gets to be kind of, like, funny. He gets to be a bit vulnerable. It shows a lot more nuance than the average John Wayne kind of, like, caricature. There's not, he doesn't say pilgrim once.
Oh, damn it. Yeah, this is not one of the John Ford movies I've seen, actually. I've only seen a few of his movies, but I also only knew of this because of kind of the whole Irish stereotype thing. Yeah, I would like to see it. I need to kind of watch more John Ford movies. I've loved what I've seen so far. I recently watched The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is a phenomenal movie.
Great fucking movie.
He does say Pilgrim in that one.
A much better movie than Sammy Fableman saw in the theater.
That's true. Yes.
Oh, and you know what? By the way, I forgot to mention the other connection this has. The Quiet Man is also played in a Spielberg movie, in E.T., during the whole, like, frog scene, like, frog dissection scene where E.T.'s watching a movie on TV. It's from The Quiet Man.
Oh, my gosh, that's so cool. Okay. Interesting. Also an interesting connection of John Wayne and Charlton Heston, two iconic screen figures who are also very complicated people. I'll just leave it at that.
Look, I'll pry that opinion from your cold, dead hands.
Oh, boy.
But what's your recommendation, or maybe not recommendation?
Yes.
For this week, Brian?
So, well, as we were kind of talking about the egregious pick, we didn't want to talk about, like, we mentioned Crash, right? Which is just we don't want to talk about that movie. Like, it's such a...
That's a
awful
minefield.
movie. Yes, exactly.
We could talk about the dumb circus movie. We're not going to talk about Crash.
But I wanted to do what did not win Best Picture, but baffling that this movie won any Oscars. Because I've told you recently, I've been thinking a lot about Meryl Streep, and I've also just been thinking a lot about, like, Oscar bait movies, because I think we're still in this conversation of, like, Oscar bait movies, and I don't think we have the same kind of Oscar bait movies as we did, say, in the early 2000s and the early 2010s, which is an era I'm kind of fascinated by, of these weird Oscar bait kind of movies. And I'm recommending what is maybe the worst movie to ever win an Oscar, I think, that I've seen so far. And that is The Iron Lady, which, again, I only watched this because it was Meryl Streep, who I love, and I've been thinking about a lot recently. And if you don't know, this is a biopic of Margaret Thatcher, Satan herself. Look, I think this movie is absolute vile garbage. I'll just be very blunt about it. I love Meryl Streep. I think she is a wonderful actor, and I feel confident saying this because she has, like, 3 Oscars, and she had been nominated at least 3 times every decade for the past like 4 decades, which is insane to think about. And she won her Oscar for this, and I cannot believe she won an Oscar for this because I think it's a really bad performance from her. And I think the movie itself is just garbage, absolutely just trash. It is a movie that, even if it doesn't want to side with Margaret Thatcher, which I think it kind of does in some ways, it uses that sort of idea that, you know, she was the only woman and she was telling it like it is, and it's using that sort of feminist angle to sort of tell her story, which is a really horrifying story if you read about anything that Margaret Thatcher did. And, you know, for example, there's a scene where she's talking with like the Secretary of War of like America, and he's like, Margaret, I've been to war, like this, you can't do this, like this is bad, like please stop doing this. And she says, unironically, well, I've been to war because I'm a woman and every day has been a war in my life. It is just absolute nonsense and absolute garbage. And it treats kind of that idea of like her being the only woman, the first woman to do this, and kind of ignores all of her just absolutely awful policies and just everything about her, which is awful. And even the supporting cast here, which is like Jim Broadbent, who I also love, is just not really doing much. Olivia Colman, maybe my favorite part of this movie, because she's just fine. She plays her daughter and she's there and is like, just has a few scenes. Phoebe Waller-Bridge shows up at a certain point. Very just cool to see her in a movie. And like Richard E. Grant is in there and everything. But yeah, I really hated this. And a lot of it is, I kind of joked to myself that this movie is Margaret Thatcher needs to think about her whole life before she dies. And yeah, just so much of the performance is her baked in this makeup, which is one of these, like an actor doing a caricature and they're just in like 500 pounds of makeup. And she's just like, confused the whole time. It's a really bad performance, I think. And it's exasperated by the fact, and I cannot stress this enough, that Meryl Streep won the Oscar over Rooney Mara in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which is an unbelievable performance and is kind of one of those like transformative performance where an actor kind of changes their entire look, but is so incredibly well done in that movie, and that performance is just unbelievable. And yeah, I can't believe that Meryl Streep won for this movie. It is absolutely just awful and vile, and I hated it. And the only good thing that came from it, from me watching this, was it kind of made me want to watch The Crown again, which is a show I actually really like. But yeah, The Iron Lady. You have seen this movie, Thomas. What do you think of The Iron Lady?
We covered this on Double Edged Double Bill as the bad pick for our Meryl Streep episode. That's the main reason why I saw it. And I mean, it's been a couple years since then. It's definitely fucking awful. I remember it just, especially when like there's all these controversies like you mentioned about Margaret Thatcher. She's such a like awful, vile politician if you like really look into her policies, like you mentioned. But at the same time, had like that kind of element of like she's the first British prime minister who was a woman, stuff like that. There's a lot of fascinating things you can talk about in that movie. And then like you mentioned, they kind of try and turn her just like into a girl boss kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, I just like there's a scene, and like you've seen this scene in other movies, obviously, that like touch on like, you know, ideas of like the first woman to do something, where she's at a dinner with all men, and she basically like says like, you know, I think poor people, they just need to like save money, and then that's what I would do. I'm not poor, but if I was one of those disgusting little poor people, that's what I would do. And all the men who are they're treated as like the enemy. They're like, no, I don't think that's where we should take our national policy. I think that poor people are, you know, we need to help them because we're the government. And yeah, it just treats her like this girl boss, but in the most just like disgusting way. Sorry, I cut you off there.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It also doesn't help that the movie, like, it's shot so flatly. True, like the whole movie has like a gray smear kind of color palette to it.
Yeah.
And especially when like I feel I would hate this movie even more if I watched it again, because post this I've seen something like Pablo Larraín's Spencer, which I feel like tries to kind of do a similar kind of like almost horror tinged version of like this person, because like aside from the stuff that you're talking about that feels very like girl boss typical biopic, there are all these scenes that are of Margaret Thatcher with dementia seeing the ghost of fucking Jim Broadbent. And that shit is like the worst stuff, because it's trying to be like, oh, it's kind of like this haunted thing of like her being visited by like her fucking husband who she loved so dearly, I guess, because they danced to, what was it, The King and I?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The fucking shall we dance bullshit. That's like their connective tissue and whatnot. Yeah, it feels like that stuff feels like way lesser versions of like what Pablo Larraín did with Spencer, in terms of kind of having a horror tinged element to like this British person with like some kind of like power and esteem attached.
I love trashy biopics. Like I said, I love The Crown. I like these kinds of. I'm as an American, I'm kind of interested in like the history of the monarchy and like the British government, because I grew up in America, and like, yeah, but it's just also just a bad movie. It's a bad version of that movie.
Especially how it just fucking hand waves the Falklands. It just so hand waves it away.
Yes, it is like horrible. I mean, just, yeah, absolutely awful. Again, from a moral perspective, it's disgusting. From a film perspective, it is just very bad. I mean, like Jim Broadbent, who like I love, but is just like there, just being like, oh, you're going through it, aren't you? Oh well, I'm here. I'm a ghost. Like, you know, he's just, it's just.
I'm here for you, Fetchy.
Yeah. Because oh god, yeah, it's a really bad movie. I think it might be one of the worst movies to win any Oscar. It also won Best Makeup, I believe, which I don't even think the makeup looks good.
No.
I mean, she looks like Margaret Thatcher, but like, congrats, I guess.
Right, and by the way, that's a very infamous Oscar year as well. That like the 2011 Oscars. So that's the same year where the artist wins Best Picture, and it's a lot of like awards like this. Like this particular, like to relate it to like the greatest show on earth, feels truly like the like, oh, we have to give Meryl another Oscar. We gotta give it to her.
Right.
We gotta have her get like the brass ring third one. Especially when like if they had just waited down to like 5 or 6 years, perfect for like The Post. I would have totally been down.
God.
That's easily, I think, her best of the recent nominations. She's so great in that movie.
Well, you don't like Florence Foster Jenkins or
Or Into the Woods. Yeah.
Into the Woods, which she was also nominated for. Right, exactly. Yeah, her 2010's Oscar run is not great, but like, yeah, The Post, she's phenomenal. I was thinking of The Post, of just like, God, Meryl kills it in that movie, and this, it's just, it's just nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And like, again, she's a great actor. She's earned a bad movie or two, but this is awful.
Yeah, and truly, I agree with like a textbook definition of particularly like that 2010s era Oscar bait. Because correct me if I'm wrong, this was like a Weinstein production, right?
It's a Weinstein, I believe. In the U.S., it was at least. Makes sense, and is like, yeah, just that perfect example of the type of Oscar bait movie that I think we don't get as many of these anymore. And even when we did, they weren't nearly as bad as this. But I'm kind of personally fascinated with these kinds of movies and how they try to just vie for awards and stuff, which I find interesting.
The last thing I really want to mention, honestly, about this is just that this was directed by a lady named Philia Lloyd. She's only made 3 movies, but I like how her 3 movies kind of form a statement. Mamma Mia, The Iron Lady herself.
They do.
Yes, because her 3 movies are Mamma Mia from 2008, The Iron Lady from 2011, and Herself from 2020.
Yeah, which I haven't seen herself. I have seen Mamma Mia. I do not like the first Mamma Mia film. I really like Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again.
Yeah.
But I am not a fan of the first movie and what Pierce Brosnan does to one of the greatest pop songs ever written.
Yeah, the first thing I think about that movie is not its direction necessarily, as much as just like, I don't know, all these celebrities getting wine drunk and doing ABBA covers. Like, fine, whatever. You don't need a lot of directorial effort for that, I guess. But, yeah, on that note, let's go ahead and wrap this segment up by repeating our titles for everybody out there so they can add these movies to your watch list, or don't. depending on the title. I would personally recommend that you do watch, instead of perhaps The Greatest Show on Earth, the 1952 other Best Picture nominee from John Ford, The Quiet Man.
Yes, and I would not recommend watching unless you're interested in Meryl Streep's career or just Oscar stuff in general, or you hate yourself. But I recommend, under huge quotations, 2011's The Iron Lady from Phyllida Lloyd.
Yeah, interesting. The Iron Lady and The Quiet Man. What kind of adventures would they get up to?
What a couple.
What a couple. Power couple, truly. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and start wrapping things up. We want to thank some people while we're wrapping up here. We want to thank Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon. Patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you get to vote for certain episodes that we cover. Certain topics, and also you get to listen to bonus podcasts. Like around this time, we would have already released our The Critic retrospective the previous month, and we're definitely going to be doing our Los Awards. That'll be at the end of February, where we pick the winners ourselves, the nominees and winners. Okay. By the way, the Academy Award nominations recently came out at the time we're recording this. Very fascinating list that I think we might be able to beat.
Yeah,
Brian,
not happy with the Oscars. Neither are we. That's why we're fixing them ourselves.
Exactly, we're fixing them and giving them a way better name, like the Los Awards.
Yeah.
And speaking of those Los Awards, last week we mentioned about the Cineast patrons submitting their choices for the Cineast Choice Award for the Loses. You all submitted your top fives, and we accumulated a top three that the Cineasts can vote on starting tomorrow on Valentine's Day, for all you lovers out there. All you Cineast patrons will be able to vote on the official finalists for the Los Award, Cineast Choice Award, in which you all get to pick between the top three that recurred through those top fives, which would be Anatomy of a Fall, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and Godzilla Minus One. Those are the three finalists that the Cineasts will get to vote on, starting, like I said, on the 14th. And you all will have until this coming Sunday, when this episode is released on the 18th, will be the final day that votes will be tabulated for, once again, the Cineast Choice Award finalists between, like I said, Anatomy of a Fall, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and Godzilla Minus One. Those three will be up on the poll over on the Patreon, and for $1 you'd be able to access that and vote between which of those three gets the coveted first Cineast Choice Award. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at cinema2letter for all that kind of stuff. Especially on Twitter, where I'm sure we're being followed by a bunch of porn bots. At this time, we've had just so many porn bot followers.
It's so annoying.
So annoying, truly.
Fucking Twitter, man.
Great place. But yeah, we're at cinema2letter on any of the socials. You can find me. I am on Letterboxd or Twitter as @NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com. And I should shout out that the same day this episode is releasing, you should also be able to hear an episode of the Target Audience podcast, in which myself and host Ben Miller talked about Adam Wingard's The Guest. That was the movie I picked to discuss. A lot of fun talking about that film over there, once again, at the Target Audience podcast.
Yeah, and you can find me on Twitter at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. And also on Letterboxd at my name, where I am much more active, and I'm watching a bunch of movies. So, yeah, follow me on there.
And for more of us in audio form, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows, the true greatest shows on Earth, over there in that feed. And you can dig into our archives and our Podbean main feed for all the previous seasons of Cinema to the Letter we've done, and also the old Double-Edged Double Bill stuff. Hear me talk about the Iron Lady from like a couple of years ago. That was a pandemic episode. So I'm sure it's fun.
I'm so sorry for your mental state at that time.
And it's all recorded. And if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight. The free way to help us out is just to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility so we can stop doing these trapeze acts. They don't work in an audio format, Brian. I keep telling you, it's not working.
I've been recording this episode 40 feet in the air, actually, this entire time.
That's true. He's hanging upside down. All the blood's rushed to his head.
That's why I watched The Iron Lady.
That's how he watched The Iron Lady in that position. It's true. But yes, now we should tease our next episode, our M for Masterpiece we'll be talking about, which was chosen by the patrons. Like I mentioned, patreon.com/cinema2letter, the cinniest patrons out there, as we call you. Ended up choosing our M for Masterpiece for this season. We will be doing Michael Clayton.
Oh, baby.
The pick-me-up we need after The Greatest Show on Earth. Yeah. Truly, that's what I call The Greatest Show on Earth. Michael Clayton, just George Clooney getting a cell phone up to Tilda Swinton's face.
An absolutely thrilling movie that has more life in it than this movie has, like, in just any bit.
Really. It's just people, like, walking around and talking to each other. It's so great.
Oh, man. God, I'm excited.
So excited for that. And we'll be talking about that next week. But until then, everybody, Brian, we got to get on the run. After this episode, we got to dress up as clowns and we got to join the circus.
I'm going to start only wearing clown makeup the entire time.
Right, which will play wonderfully once again in audio form. We just keep coming up with great ways to enhance the audio here.